men should see the women going to the polls. To put down the liquor traffic needed vex their souls. If we're angels as they tell us, can we once suppose that all the men should frown on us when going to the polls? We love our boys, our household joys, we love our girls as well. The law of love is from above, against that we ne'er rebel. No discharge have Christian women from the war with sin. At the polls with Gog and Magog must the fight begin. Since we've Bible marching orders, need it fright our souls, though all the men...
Good morning, I'm Paula Freund, and we're here at the Petaluma Historical Library and Museum, and I am going to give you a gallery tour of our current exhibit, which is entitled Petaluma's Participation in the Women's Suffrage Movement, a commemoration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. There's a little bit of a history to this exhibit I'd like to let you know really briefly, and that is I didn't know what the 19th Amendment was, to start with. And I was enlightened by my co-curator, Catherine Reinhardt, who put out a clarion call to all historical institutions in Sonoma County in 2019 and said, what are you doing to celebrate the centennial this year of the ratification of the 19th Amendment? So, as the curator of the exhibit, I have posted the text of the 19th Amendment, and I'd like to read it to you. It's brief. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Aha. I now knew what this was all about, and I wanted to be involved. I called Catherine right away, and I said, Catherine, do you think we could co-curate an exhibit about Petaluma's participation in this women's movement to obtain the vote? She said, you know, I think there is sufficient information. We got to work researching, and we discovered a treasure trove of information about our community and the early pioneers and their participation in the fight to get women the right to vote. I think you will be pleasantly surprised with the exhibit and with the events that are coming up, and you can find out about them at petalumamuseum.com. So, moving forward, the exhibit is dedicated to two wonderful Petalumans, the Honorable Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey and a former mayor, Helen Putnam. Here we are at the second display panel for the exhibit, and it opens up traditionally enough with some portraits of some early pioneers and the most famous ones, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And that's the traditional way with these two women and with what went on at Seneca Falls. It's a very traditional way to open up a discussion of American suffrage movement. But it's particularly appropriate for us here in Petaluma because these two women, although they didn't live to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment, they did leave a very important primary document called The History of Women's Suffrage. And in that document, in 1881, they cited 5 Petaluman suffragists. And I quote from their book. They're the most important primary resource for this movement. And I'm quoting on their chapter on California. Sonoma County has a few fearless friends of women's suffrage at Petaluma. Mrs. A. Haskell, Mr. and Mrs. A. L. Hatch, Kate Lovejoy, and Mrs. Judge Latimer organized a society in 1869. When I read that, I was very excited. I informed my friend John Sheehy and Catherine, and John Sheehy went forward and wrote bios on all of these early Petaluma suffragists, and we realized that we had a wonderful story to tell. I want to tell you something that really sings to my heart, and it doesn't tie in totally with Petaluma, but it's really a wonderful story. And that is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the female George Washington of America. She was brilliant. She was a philosopher, and she was a brilliant writer. What she did is she organized Seneca Falls along with her friend Lucretia Mott, and Lucretia Mott was a Quaker, and the two women were very, very diligent abolitionists, fighting very hard to eliminate slavery in the United States before the Civil War. So they got together at Seneca Falls, and a black gentleman joined them, Frederick Douglass. Elizabeth Cady Stanton put forth her resolutions and declarations and sentiments about how women were treated in the United States of America, and she was angry. And she wrote it along the same format of the Declaration of Independence, which was quite brilliant, actually, and why I made that analogy to Thomas Jefferson. And in it, she presented to the women, to this conference, this group of women and a few men, and their last resolution was to fight for suffrage. Well, the women thought, oh, that's going too far. And this is in 1848. That's going too far. We can't ask for suffrage. But this gentleman stood up, and he said, you must fight for suffrage. He said, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. And it was Frederick Douglass who stood up and convinced them, ladies, don't be afraid of this. This is foundational for you. And they voted the resolution in. Later, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and Frederick Douglass, and several other important people, including Lucretia Mott, got together and they started the American Equal Rights Association. And the American Equal Rights Association put out a petition in 1867. These early suffragists got together and they wanted to issue a petition to Congress and tell them, demand, after the Civil War, they wanted to demand equal suffrage for women and for black men. And they issued a very important document. It's known as the American Equal Rights Association. And in it, they wanted universal suffrage, something way ahead of its time. We still do not have universal suffrage in the United States. Unfortunately, these people were not successful. But they set precedents. They set precedents for establishing petitions in the movement. And this is a very, very, very precious, precious document for the history of the movement. And I present it because that's what Petaluma did. They created petitions. But before we get there and talk about the Petaluma petitions, let's back up a little bit and look at what was going on in the nation and in California. In the late 1860s and the beginning of the 1870s, the women's suffrage movement was going strong on the East Coast, mostly inspired by abolitionists. And something else was happening. And that was a group of women who were very, very radical were getting involved in the women's suffrage movement. And the woman who headed that up, her name was Victoria California Woodhull. She was not from California, but her parents gave her that middle name. And she was quite the radical and quite shocking and very powerful and very important in the movement. In the end, she was shamed by the Comstock laws, and she moved to England, never to return to the United States. But she did set a precedence for radicalism. And the women's suffrage movement divided into two groups, one more conservative and one more radical. One of those radicals was Laura DeForest Gordon. And at the end, in 1860, at the end of the 1860s, she came out to California. She was a brilliant woman. She was an attorney. She was a suffragist, and she was a spiritualist. She was a member of a group of women who believed that women should have equal rights in all areas of life, and particularly in our religious life. Women didn't want to be pushed around by the clergy who inferred that they were inferior. And the spiritualists also were known because they believed they could communicate with the dead, and that there were special women who had that power. Well, Laura DeForest Gordon was one of those women, and she was a Californian. She came early, towards the end of the 1860s, to work for the suffrage movement and to spread spiritualism. The descriptions of her ability to speak are universally complimentary in her ability to fire up a group. Her logic, her power, everyone attested to it. She was a powerful woman. And she's best known for, in the state of California, making it so women could practice law in the state of California. So here she was at the end of the 1860s in California, in San Francisco. And it wasn't the abolitionist movement that really spurred the suffrage movement in California. It was the suffragists. It was a group of women and some men who were powerful speakers, and they were promulgating spiritualism, but also suffrage. So, Laura DeForest Gordon, and very possibly a woman who was raised a Quaker, Anna Dickinson, were in San Francisco and touring the area, going to small communities and saying, you know, we want you to start a local suffrage organization. And they got to a woman named Abigail, and we believe, excuse me, we're pretty certain, they got to a woman named Abigail Goodwin Haskell. In 1869, actually on December 25th, in the Petaluma Argus was put a special notice that was submitted by Abigail Goodwin Haskell. It was an invitation to her home to come to gather if you were interested in women's suffrage. We're pretty certain that it was Laura DeForest Gordon and Anna Dickinson who inspired Abigail to do that. She put in her ad in the paper and invited friends to come to her home to establish the Sonoma County Woman Suffrage Association. Now that association, the name of it, often when organizations are first founded, they have more than one name. And it was also referred to as the Petaluma Woman Suffrage Association, but it did end up being referred to in the more general term, Sonoma County. And Abigail got these women together at her home and they established this organization. They established it because in 1970 they wanted to be ready to go to the California Women's Suffrage Association meeting, the convention, in January in 1970. And what this group of women and men were doing was they wanted to create a petition, a California petition, to send to the California legislature, asking them to give women the right to vote. Undeniably, Abigail was the initiator in Petaluma of soliciting signatories, people to sign the petition. And right away, she scheduled 2 suffrage lectures in Petaluma. She scheduled a lecture given by Reverend C.C. Ames, who was a member of the he was originally a member of the California Women's Suffrage Association. He came and spoke at Hinshaw Hall in Petaluma on January 11th of 1870. And Laura DeForest Gordon came the same month and was invited to speak here in town as well. So Abigail and her friends who joined the organization got to work right away. So the other women who were involved, there was a woman named Lucretia Ann Newton Hatch, and she was a dedicated spiritualist, just like Laura DeForest Gordon. And very possibly that's what drew her to be involved in the organization. It's very interesting, those early suffragists and women who were more radical, they were condemned as promiscuous. And so was Lucretia Hatch. At the end of her at the end of her husband's life, he died. She became a widow and should have inherited his estate, and she did, but not after fighting powers that tried to say that she was a bigamist and that she was a promiscuous woman. So she was one of the early suffragists here in Petaluma. There was also a lady called Lucretia Newton Hatch. You can read all about her. Sarah Rich Latimer, and you can read all about her in John Sheehy's bio, and you can read about Ms. Hatch in John Sheehy's bio as well. 2 more early Petaluma suffragists, there in the early 1870s, was Helen Hewlett Button. She was more of a traditional evangelical Christian, and later on went to be part of the suffrage movement, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The other final woman who was mentioned in the early history I told you about at the beginning was Kate Hutton Lovejoy, and we've done our best to research her. Catherine and John have done an excellent job, but she's a little evasive. History has not left us a lot of information about her. We do know, though, that she was involved in the suffrage movement. So let's go back and look at the petition that these women worked so hard to create. So in early 1870, those Sonoma County Women's Suffrage Association members were working hard to solicit signatories, people to sign the petition, the 1870 California petition. I'd like to read what the petition says to you, because it's in that wonderful Victorian verbiage that's so inspiring. It says here, Petition for Women's Suffrage in Senate, March 2nd, 1870. Petition for Women's Suffrage. To the Honorable, the Senators and Representatives of the State of California in Legislature assembled. The undersigned residents of the state of California, in full lawful age, respectfully and earnestly pray your honorable body to take such immediate action for an amendment to Section 1st, Article of 2nd of the Constitution of the state as shall secure to the women of this Commonwealth the right of suffrage. And to this end, your petitioners will ever pray. I love it. So this petition, this California petition of 1870, was sent from the towns of San Francisco, Petaluma, Santa Cruz, Nevada City, Sacramento, South San Diego, Gilroy, and Oakland. And altogether, there were about 3,300 signatures. Petaluma had the second most signatures behind San Francisco, with, excuse me, I should know that number, with 424 signatures. That's pretty impressive. Those gals and Mr. Hatch, the early suffragists, were doing their work. And I did a lot of research as to who these people were. What kind of person would sign this petition? You know, I think today, outside of a grocery store, we might sign a petition because someone asked us to. I think back then it was a little different. I think it was quite a solemn thing to do. And so these people were quite honest about how they felt about signing for women's suffrage. So I did a little bit of research. Who were these people? And John Sheehy, well, this was not me, this was John Sheehy, identified 4 black signatories on the 1870 petition. And let me make a point that John made to me, which bowled me over. He said these 4 black people, they were 2 couples, and let me give you their names. They were Eliza and Cooper Smith, and Malvina and Alexander McFarland. Both of the gentlemen were trustees of the African Episcopalian, Methodist Episcopalian Church here in Petaluma. And they signed this petition, and John pointed this out to me, and this is a very poignant point, that they signed this in 1870, a few months before the 15th Amendment was ratified, giving black men the right to vote. So these black men signed a petition giving women the right to vote, and they did not have the right to vote. Quite a kind and altruistic thing to do on the part of these people. And John has written up some fascinating information about those 4 people. So the 1870 petition was submitted on March 2nd, 1870. It then went to what they called committee. And Laura DeForest Gordon defended it in committee in front of the gentleman, and she did that on March 9th. Later, on March 18th, Abigail Goodwin Haskell, along with a few other suffragists from the California Women's Suffrage Association, defended the petition on March 18th. And Abigail gave a speech. Not many women were allowed to give speeches in front of the legislature. Laura DeForest Gordon was allowed, and Abigail Goodwin Haskell was allowed, the Petaluman Abigail Goodwin Haskell. She gave a wonderful speech. We have a copy of it, and I am very proud to say that the Petaluma Readers Theater, under the leadership of Jennifer March, will be reciting her wonderful speech to the California legislature, and their event's going to be pre-recorded, and I believe it's going to be available by the end of September. On the wall, all the people who signed the 1870 petition, their bases are in gold. The base of their label is in gold. And the people who signed, and we haven't gotten there yet, but this is the next exciting thing, the people who signed the 1878 petition, their bases are in purple. So we had the 1870 petition, 424 Petalumans signed, and they came from many different walks of life, and we'll talk about the suffragists in general from Petaluma in just a minute. But first I want to talk about the 1878 petition. And it was, the person who orchestrated it was an absolutely fascinating gentleman here in Petaluma, and his name was Freeman Parker. John Sheehy has done a lot of research on Mr. Parker, and he was an organic intellectual par excellence. And I hope that you all can come and read his biography and really come to understand and love this wonderful early Petaluma pioneer who lived many, many years. And I want to quote what was said to him in Tom Gregory's History of Sonoma County. It says, "Mr. Parker is and has been for many years much interested in all true reforms that tend to save time and money and to elevate the people to a position of independence and make them honest, just, intelligent, and self-reliant." Well, he was the one who was responsible, just like Abigail and her group of Sonoma County woman suffragists. They were responsible for getting the 1870 petition together. He was responsible for getting the 1878 petition together. And 200, and I should know this number off the top of my head, and 200 and I believe 24 Petalumans signed the 1878 petition. So let's think about who signed these petitions. They have been termed by other researchers talking about pioneer suffragists in other communities. They've been termed organic intellectuals, and I find that very interesting. They're people who are maybe have no formal education, but who have educated themselves and who have done unbelievably fascinating things within their community using their brains. They were all kind of like 19th century MacGyvers. And let me read a little bit about these people, what some of these people did. Oh, and by the way, altogether, there were 636 signatories. And we found portraits of about 100 of them. And I selected the portraits which had the quality that you could present to the public and that represented an exceptional Petaluman or represented a group of Petalumans. So I wrote here that many of the Petalumans could fit the description of organic intellectuals. One man who stood out to me was Alfonso Bauer. He was an inventor of river dredging equipment. He was a lithographer, he was an engineer, he was written up in a huge article in the Overland magazine, which was the premier magazine of the time, and he was a dedicated, long-time Petaluman. There was W.W. Carpenter. He was the originator for the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in California back in the 19th century. He was a doctor as well. We have Philip Cohen. He was the inventor of a method to eliminate fraud in the reproduction of postal stamps. He was also a fascinating man. He owned the bookstore here in Petaluma. There was John Backup Lewis. He was a collector of prehistoric Native American artifacts. He lived out by Lake Tole, and he was aware of the value of these Native American artifacts that were on his land. He diligently collected them, and he created the Lewis Museum, which unfortunately has been lost to posterity. But it was written about in the early newspapers. There was Richard Reese Percival. He was a very innovative Petaluma pioneer photographer here in Petaluma. So very special group of people here. Very, very individualistic and thinkers, real thinkers. Many of the Petaluma suffragists were very successful capitalists. Among the group included Myron Fairbanks, maybe you all have heard that name, William Hill, John Kavanaugh, and Ezekiel Denman. And many of the people were founders and founding members of Petaluma's early social, cultural, and charitable organizations. Among them, the International Organization of Good Templars, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, the Sonoma County Women's Suffrage Association, which we've already discussed, the Petaluma Temperance Union, the Antietam Women's Relief Corps, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and very importantly, the Grange. The Grange played a very important part with Freeman Parker and with the 1878 petition. We found that many of the people who signed this 1878 petition were Grangers. And we went to the Thompson Atlas and found their farms. And the beautiful Thompson Atlas illustrations have been reproduced, put on black backgrounds, and made available for you to look at. Looking at the detail of those farms is really very, very, very informative. They're precious images, and they really give you a feeling for what it was like to be a farmer in Petaluma in the 1870s and 80s.
the knowledge that the Grange was important in the early suffragist movement is something that's being researched by scholars now, and has been researched in the last few months since the beginning of the centennial. What it was the Grange was a group of farmers who were working, who were very progressive thinking, and who wanted to establish American ideals and freedom for the working individual. Big Ag was coming into the picture, and Big Ag was telling them what they were going to give farmers for the price of their food, and the Grangers wanted to be more independent from that. So these small farmers wanted freedom, and they wanted women to vote. Freeman Parker was an advocate for women. In the Grange, it's kind of interesting, they elected Circe and Pomona, ancient fertility goddesses, to be on part of the power structure of the Grange. Women voted in all the Grange meetings, and so it's kind of a wonderful, rural, grassroots American force behind the women's suffrage movement, and we have Freeman Parker to thank for Petaluma's Grange involvement in that 1878 petition. Now, what Parker did was he took the petition, which had all the handwritten notes on it, all the hand signatures on it, and he sent it to Washington, D.C. And I have been in touch with the Library of Congress and asked them, do you still have the original? Because we don't have it. And they told me that due to COVID, my request was on back hold. So we don't know if the Library of Congress has retained that original document, which Freeman Parker claimed he sent to Washington, D.C. Now, he sent the original to Washington, D.C., but then he copied all the signatures by hand on a second version of the petition, and he sent it to his fellow Petaluman, Albion Paris Whitney. Albion Paris Whitney's portrait in a magnificent oil painting, and along with his wife Susan, is hanging in the Petaluma parlor and has been there for many years. Albion Paris Whitney was a state senator in California at this time. So Parker sent this to his friend Albion and said, I want you to present this to the state legislature. I've sent the original to Washington, D.C., and we want you all to consider giving women the right to vote. I have not been able to find a reply from Albion, but the petition, we don't know if it ever went to committee, but it was let go. No action was taken on the petition. We don't know if Albion was a supporter of women's suffrage. Neither he nor his wife Susan signed the 1870 or the 1878 petitions. But we do know that after Albion died, his wife Susan became quite a devoted advocate for women's suffrage, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Okay, so we have this early Petaluma movement beginning in 1869 with Abigail. We have her forming the group. We have the 1870 petition being signed by so many Californians, 424. Then we have Freeman Parker doing the 1878 petition. And these petitions are based on the concept that women should have equal rights. They're based on principle. The principles established by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and other early women. Things change, though, in the 1880s. Things start to change. And the justification for women voting goes from being that they should be men's equals to women are more moral than men, and they need to clean things up. And it's associated mostly with the temperance movement, with the desire to eliminate liquor from the American culture. The most powerful advocate for that was Frances Willard. She was a fascinating woman. She's been compared to Oprah Winfrey in her popularity and her influence. And the Women's Christian Temperance Movement Union, WCTU, originally wasn't for suffrage until she became president. She was the second president. And she said, no, ladies, we must We must work for suffrage. So she told all these conservative Christian women they should want to vote because it was their responsibility to clean up politics and to clean up our society. So she advocated for both very strongly. And she was a very brilliant woman, and she was an unbelievable marketer. She was Oprah Winfrey of her time. She came to Petaluma, and she spoke in 1883 at the invitation of the Petaluma Women's the Petaluma Women's Christian Temperance Union. She gave her speech, and in the Petaluma Argus, they talked about the fact that she supported suffrage, and the reason she supported it was that women would vote for temperance, would vote down the liquor industry's power. And the other paper in Petaluma didn't say that she mentioned suffrage. Instead, they say, and I quote, they commented at length on Willard's admonishment to women to keep their boys at home at night and out of the saloons by making their homes pleasant. So we have a definite, complete change as far as the justification for giving women the right to vote. And we have the very powerful Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was very powerful in Petaluma. And we'll have some more to say about that after we talk about the results of the 1911 campaign. One of the people who was the most a powerful advocate for temperance in Petaluma was Lorenzo Waugh. And he is a nationally important figure because he wrote a biography that went through 5 printings. It was very popular. In the last printing, which was published in 1885, he included reference to Willard's trip to Petaluma and about her coming, her talking about temperance, and he and she were comrades, colleagues in that movement, in that temperance movement. So in his 1885 edition of his autobiography, he mentions Willard Cumming, and he refers to her as that sweet girl who came and did her work for temperance. And he also included her review of his earlier edition of his book. He included that in his 1885 edition, her review of an earlier edition of his book, and she refers to it as that unique little book. So we get a feeling there is a little bit of passive-aggressive commentary going on there between the two of them, which is a bit interesting. Also, a very telling image, which I was really happy to know about, was this very early portrait of the first full-time librarian in Petaluma, and her name was Lackey. She was the first Petaluma librarian, and she served when the library was on the 3rd floor of the Petaluma Courthouse, City Hall, excuse me, when she was on the 3rd floor of the City Hall. We have a picture of her sitting at her desk, at her librarian's desk, and over her head is a portrait of Frances Willard. And I'm sure that she selected that because Ms. Lackey was a founding member of Petaluma's Women's Christian Temperance Union. It's also very telling that on the opposite wall to Willard's portrait is a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, who at that point would have been deceased. The photograph was taken between 1896 and 1899, but a portrait of Abraham Lincoln in the library. When Frances Willard died, the Petaluma Women's Christian Temperance Union went all out at their meetings and issuing memorials and memorandum to her. They really did idolize her, and she did work for the women's suffrage movement and did push it forward, although on a very different basis than the earlier suffragists. So the relationship between suffrage, temperance, prohibition was very important and very complicated. And that subject has been researched in detail by Petaluma historian and my friend, John Sheehy. And he's going to be giving a presentation, which will probably be pre-recorded, but available at petalumamuseum.com. And I'm very excited that he is going to bring a lot of clarity to that subject. It's going to be very informative.
And he's going to be, and he was scheduled for October 28th. If possible, it'll be live here and recorded at the Petaluma Historical Library Museum, and if not, it will be pre-recorded and available at the end of October. We skip forward to the 1890s at this point, and specifically to 1896. In 1896, there was a campaign for suffrage in California to give women the right to vote. And it was so important for the national movement that the Grande Dame, Susan B. Anthony, came to San Francisco to help with the campaign. There's this wonderful picture of her in Yosemite on a mule that's just wonderful. It's wonderful. So she came to California, and she brought two women with her. She brought the Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, and she also brought Carrie Chapman Catt, two pillars of women's suffrage. They were young at that time, though, when Anthony came. And we have this is the masterpiece of the exhibit right here. I love it. It is a portrait of the Grande Dame, Susan B. Anthony, in a San Francisco studio. On the Grande Dame's right is Anna Howard Shaw. On her left is Carrie Chapman Catt, who is right here. And then she's surrounded by the rest of the California suffragists. And they had their portrait taken together, and it is magnificent. I was given permission to reproduce this portrait by Rochester University. They have a large portion of Susan B. Anthony's personal belongings and a fabulous collection of all kinds of artifacts dealing with her life. And they gave me permission to reproduce this and I've mounted it in a really magnificent period frame from the 1880s, 1890s. So if you get a chance to come and see these ladies assembled, it's just a beautiful image. Well, so Susan B. is here to work hard for the 1896 campaign. And the reason this is here, what does this have to do with Petaluma? Well, the reason this is here is the Petaluma Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Petaluma Women's Christian Temperance Union invited Dr. Anna Shaw to come and speak. And she came, she spoke about the importance of women and the home and voting for suffrage. And we have a wonderful portrait of the Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw right here. And she spoke in Petaluma in May and October. She spoke twice in 1898, invited by the Petaluma Women's Christian Temperance Union. On the other hand, we have Carrie Chapman Catt, who lectured in Petaluma on October 29th. In 1896, in support of the campaign. And she was invited by the Petaluma Political Equality Club. So the two different Petaluma clubs invited the two different women at the same time in relationship to this campaign. And we have them pictured here, and there's information here about them being in Petaluma and lecturing for our community and stumping for the suffrage campaign. In this wonderful portrait, all the young women have been identified, but there's a woman missing from this portrait, and that is Naomi Bowman Talbert Anderson, who was a black woman. And she began work for the suffrage movement in the 60s and 70s in the East Coast, out in the Midwest and the East Coast. She moved to San Francisco, and she campaigned vigilantly for the 1896 campaign. She's not included in the portrait of the other suffragists, and that's unfortunate. I do have a panel dedicated to her here, and if you read the newspaper articles in the San Francisco newspapers, it is amazing how often she is referred to, how highly respected she was as a speaker. She was a poetess as well, and the more I researched her life, she is a hugely inspirational woman. And I love this quote. I want to repeat it. Like our 1870 petitioners, black petitioners for the Petaluma Pioneer, she was affiliated with the African Methodist, Episcopal, and Baptist churches. And she was quoted as saying, "The colored men know what it is to be deprived of the ballot, and I am sure they will do what they can to release white and colored women from the same humiliating state of silent slavery." The 1896 campaign was not successful, And indubitably, it was the liquor industry which quashed it in the last days. And Susan B. Anthony was aware that that was going to be a problem. And she even got a hold of Frances Willard and said, I know you have your annual convention for the National Women's Christian Temperance Union scheduled in San Francisco. Can you please not have it here while we're having our campaign? Frances understood, and she moved it to St. Louis, Missouri. But that wasn't enough. The liquor industry defeated the campaign in California. This panel is dedicated to Josie Hill, Isabel Denman, Susan Whitney. They were three hostesses of the Petaluma Political Equality Club. So around this time, the matrons of communities, the leaders, the female leaders, would get together in their fashionable homes as the political equality club of their community to try and support suffrage. It was associated with they were working particularly hard to support the 1896 campaign that failed. And we had these three women in Petaluma which were part of that movement. The first one was Josephine Pilkington Hill, and she signed both petitions, the 1870 and 1878, and it's fun because we found a signature on the 1878 petition who had the same name as Josie's maiden name, Pilkington. And it was Margaret Pilkington, and a little bit of research, we found out that was her mother who lived with the Hills in Petaluma. And here's a wonderful portrait of the elderly woman with her grandchild. So she signed the 1878 petition along with her daughter, Josie. Josie Hill also, her descendant, courtesy Melissa Hill Pease, allowed us to scan and reproduce a letter from Henry B. Blackwell, who was the husband of Lucy Stone, the great suffragist who's up there with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it's a letter to Ms. Hill, dated 1892, and he's asking her to seek subscriptions to the magazine that he and his wife were responsible for publishing, the Woman's Journal. And that's a pretty special artifact right there. We have some information here about the home of Josephine, and it was here in Petaluma, and a beautiful write-up by Catherine Reinhardt. We also have information here about Isabel Denman. Isabel Denman was the second wife of Ezekiel Denman, and she was quite a lady. And on the Registrar of Voters in 1112, when she could first register, she listed herself as a capitalist, which I thought was very interesting. And her daughter, Nellie Louisa Denman, who also signed the 1878 petition, listed herself as a housekeeper. This was a wealthy family. She was the stepdaughter of Isabel. She never married, and she considered herself the keeper of the home, which I thought was very, very interesting. But together, the two women signed the 1878 petition, and they held political equality club meetings at their home and supported suffrage. A third woman here at this time in Petaluma was Susan Durgan Eastman Whitney, who was the senator's wife. Once the senator passed, she became involved in suffrage. We're not certain that maybe he didn't approve of her being involved. We have a lovely picture of her home. Thanks to the people who live there now, they had a picture of Susan, and she's actually outside on the porch. She was a diminutive gal. So Susan, it's kind of fun, in a Argus article in 1896, it said she was out in her carriage with her beautiful white horse, and on the sides was "Vote for women's suffrage the day of." So she was out campaigning and canvassing for the purpose of suffrage for women. Susan had a daughter, and there's a wonderful picture here. I have a group portrait with her daughter, and the other women in the picture are all graduates of Mill College. So obviously, to Susan, the education of her daughter was an important issue. So it's a lovely, lovely portrait of her daughter, which was included. Catherine Reinhardt, as an architectural historian, has been very interested in the homes of the suffragists. And Scott Hess has gone out and photographed those portraits of those homes. Portraits of the homes, I think that's correct. Portraits of those homes for the exhibit. And we see here the beautiful, beautiful home on 6th Street, which was originally the home, the Denman home. That is thanks to Scott Hess. And on the other wall with the early suffragists, we had Abigail Goodwin Haskell's home, which we believe is her home. We're still doing research on Rose Cottage, Abigail's Rose Cottage. That was beautifully photographed by Mr. Hess, as was the home of Ellen Button. So the 1896 campaign failed. But these women were tenacious. Their fortitude was amazing, not just in Petaluma, not just in California, but throughout the nation. In my research on the suffrage movement, the fact that these women just kept fighting it's amazing. I think I would have given up, but they didn't. So they've got my deep respect. So what the California women did when the 1896 suffrage campaign failed, they regathered the troops, and we had the 1911 California suffrage campaign. What was happening just before this time was Western states had been giving women the right to vote. Eastern, no. So depending on what state you lived in as a woman, you may be able to vote or you may not be able to vote. And California became the sixth star, the sixth state to grant women the right to vote in 1911. But it was a harrowing campaign. It was very different from the 1896 campaign in that by this time, you could do mass marketing. These women went all out with buttons, with flyers, with banners, with huge posters. It was quite the modern campaign. And lots of fun memorabilia and collectibles come from that time. One of the most magnificent images produced in 1911 for the campaign was this portrait by Boyer, by Bertha Margaret Boyer. They had a contest, a poster contest for the 1911 campaign, and she won it with this magnificent composition. I had help with this exhibit in the form of two Petaluma historians, Catherine J. Reinhardt and John Sheehy. I am an art historian, and this is a magnificent composition. It's a woman who looks a lot like Lucy Stone, which I mentioned earlier. Her haircut's very unusual, and that's how Lucy Stone wore her hair. She's at the Golden Gate. Obviously, the Golden Gate Bridge has not been constructed yet. And behind her is the setting sun, who gives you a little bit of a feeling of a haloed angel. And that, I'm sure, was intentional. She also gives you a gesture of welcome. But that welcome has a big banner written on it, Votes for Women. So it's a two-sided message. The colors, the combination of the different oranges and different yellows is masterful. The beautiful Art Nouveau decoration on the bottom of her cape is in the style of the time. It is a beautiful, beautiful composition and has been acknowledged as so. And during the 1911 campaign was plastered everywhere due to its beauty and its power. So, women working really hard for suffrage, but women really working hard against suffrage as well. The anti-suffrage movement, well, from the very beginning, had a say and was an important force that the suffragists had to work against. Their own women fighting against suffrage. And it's a very interesting story, which I won't go into right now. But a gentleman called Josie Miller has done a lot of research on this topic. And he's really revealed a lot of things about the anti-suffrage movement, which are very enlightening. And I was fascinated by it. And if you're interested, read the work of Josie Miller. He's made some very interesting points, and that really forces you to look at it all on a much deeper level. In California, during the 1911 campaign, the real guy who was against women's suffrage was Senator J.B. Sanford. I've seen his portraits, and I can say without hesitation that he was one handsome devil and quite the dandy, and I think he was probably extremely charismatic. He wrote the dissenting argument against the amendment, Proposition 4, against it. And he is right here in all his dandy handsomeness with that wonderful mustache. And I am very happy to say that my dear friend Jeff Elliott, Santa Rosa historian, is going to be presenting a performance impersonating Senator Sanford. He said, tell the audience to bring rotten tomatoes. I don't know if that's going to be possible. It's probably going to end up pre-recorded due to the times that we live in, but that will definitely be something fun to look forward to. From the Petaluma Regional Library, we have an original page here from the San Francisco Chronicle, which was issued by the Northern California Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And they bought that billboard within that broadside and put it up as a broadside and bought ad space in the San Francisco Chronicle on October 9th, the day before the October 10th vote. So it was a powerful group. The anti-group was powerful. To understand it gives deeper insight to the suffrage movement, and not much research has been done on it, but recently Josie Miller has made great contributions for our understanding of that movement. Another exciting thing about the exhibit is the event that is going to happen, got my fingers crossed, maybe live, maybe just maybe a pre-recording or live, whichever's appropriate. And it is going to be a one-woman play written and performed by Jessica Litwack. And it's about the Selena Salmons story. Selena Salmons was a San Francisco suffragist and she wrote the definitive explanation of the 1911 campaign. And with that primary resource, Jessica was able to write a really magnificent one-woman play. And that's hopefully going to either, as I said, be live streamed or pre-recorded, or if possible at the time in October, maybe we can have performances of it here or out under the oak, but it will be a real treat to look forward to as well. So Selena Salmons was a powerful force in the 1911 campaign, and hopefully we can learn more about her through Jessica's play. So one of the big issues in the 1911 campaign was working women. Were equal pay. Can you believe that we're still talking about equal pay for equal work? And in Petaluma, it was a powerful theme. We see from the Petaluma Historical Library and Museum's collection, I was able to have printed off some beautiful images, one of the workers at the silk mill here in Petaluma, and one of the girls of the Raymond department store here in Petaluma. So we see that we had a lot of working women, a lot of working women in Petaluma and throughout the nation at this time, where previously there weren't so many women working. Now we've got women working, and it was a big issue in 1911, and Selena Salmons was an advocate for helping working women. And they realized that it was only through getting the vote that they could improve their working conditions. In Petaluma, just prior to the 1911 campaign, the Political Equality Club did sponsor many suffragists to come and lecture. And they lectured in the Hill Opera House, which had been funded by Josephine Hill. She wanted a place in Petaluma that was elegant and people could come and speak, and where theater could be performed in vaudeville. And pretty soon that Hill Opera House became one of the premier venues in the Bay Area. But they did have some important speakers come and speak prior to the 1911 campaign at the Hill Opera House. There was Dr. Charles F. Asked, who is known as a founder of the Passive Resistance League. He was an advocate for peace and spoke here on women's suffrage, thanks to the Petaluma Political Equality Club. And they also had Helen Hoy Greeley come and speak, who at the time was quite an important suffragist. And she was introduced by Anna Morrison Reed. We'll speak about her in just a minute after we're done here. But the suffrage, 1911 suffrage campaign, women won the vote by a tiny margin, San Francisco voted it down, and according to the statistics and according to the scholars, it was because of the liquor industry. It was the rural areas that voted in women's right to vote. At the end of the evening of the election, the women were pretty certain that they'd lost. But the results came in from the countryside, and they won by a very, very, very small margin. And I'm embarrassed to say, and I have to do it. Would rather not, but I'm going to do it because it's the right thing. Petaluma voted down the 1911 suffrage amendment. It was 332 for and 336 against. Don't tell me your vote doesn't count. So we voted it down. Santa Rosa voted for it, but by a very small margin. So women were given the vote in California in 1911 by the skin of their teeth. Anna Morrison Reed came to suffrage a little late. She started out as not pro-suffrage. She became a suffragist later. She was an amazing woman. She was most importantly a printer. And she had her printing press here in Petaluma, and she had her printing press as well as in Ukiah as well. But she lived here many years, and she stumped for suffrage. And her relative wrote a book about her and included her diaries and a lot of her original writing. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and is very informative and a fabulous primary source on her life. She did publish a publication called The Northern Crown, and in it she published several pro-suffrage articles, and they're very interesting. They make for very interesting reading. One thing I'd like to say about Anna Morrison Reed is I worked really hard to find a good portrait of her. On the cover of her book, there's a magnificent oval portrait of her with an ermine collar and a great big ostrich feather in her hat, and it's just magnificent. And I said, oh, I've got to get that because I've got this great frame to put it in, the oval frame. And I found that all of her original photographs had been Xeroxed back in probably the 70s and thrown out. So that was quite a disappointment. I got the best image I possibly could of her, which is as a younger woman here when she was probably not a pro-suffragist. But I got it, and Bill Kane at Digital Grange did his best to make it come alive for me. And then my friend Barbara Maxwell colorized the portrait. They did that at the turn of the century and in the 19th century. They would colorize photos. Barbara colorized Anna's portrait here and brought her to life and did a phenomenal job. So I just love this image. I think we're very, very lucky to have it, and it is another masterpiece in the exhibit. So Anna Morrison Reed supported suffrage. She introduced Greeley at the Hill Opera House in 1911, and lived a long life and was a fascinating woman. If you want to read about an interesting pioneer, read about Anna Morrison Reed. John Sheehy did a beautiful bio on her, and you can read that at his blog. I also found an article in the clippings that Grandma Kennedy registered on Wednesday, right after the election, the 1911 election, and when she registered, she was 105 years old. And she was a beloved figure in Sonoma County. She must have been she was reported to have been a very lovely lady, and she lived a long time. I thought, just by chance, I'm going to see, did she register in in the 1878 petition, possibly? She did. So I found her. I was just delighted to find her signature on the 1878 Petaluma petition requesting suffrage for women. So I wrote here, she stayed true to her suffragist sentiments and at age 102, at 102, registered to vote directly after the 1911 California suffrage campaign. She died at 105, but she registered at 102. She stayed true to her suffrage sentiments. She signed that Petaluma petition in 1878, and she registered to vote in 1911. I just thought that was a wonderful follow-through story. Well, realizing that, I had to take it a step further. And I went to see Diva Provo in the voter registration office. She is a delightful woman. And she allowed me to look through a document called the Index to the Registration Affidavits of the Election Precincts of Sonoma County, California. There were 11 Petaluma precincts in that document. And what it listed was everyone who registered in 1912. I thought, I can determine how many women, Petaluma women, went out and registered as soon as they got the right to vote. I got to figure out the statistics. I'm not really good at math. My friend Jeff Elliott actually helped me with the math. What percentage? I don't know. But anyway, we added it all up. I added it all up and gave him a call. The total number of registered voters within the 11 precincts of Petaluma in 1912, right after women won the right to vote, was 1,845. And 795 of them were women. So 795 women in Petaluma went out as soon as they got the right and registered to vote. And I said, Jeff, what percentage of the voters are women? He said, oh, dear Paula. He said 43%. So 43% of the voters in Petaluma, in the 11 precincts, the first year they got the right to vote, were women. I think that's a pretty impressive statistic. So that's kind of exciting. It's also a fascinating document that Provo allowed me to look at. And it was interesting, all of the occupations that women listed. Yes, most of them listed themselves as housewives, but there were teachers, silk workers, due to the silk factory, merchants, laundress, a lot of stenographers, shoe fitter, garment worker, dressmaker, housekeeper, capitalist. I was fascinated how many women actually listed themselves as capitalists. Sales lady, telephone operator, nurse, musician, bookkeeper, candy maker, doctor. There were 4 female doctors listed. Machine operator, orchardist, and accountant. In addition to that, I was able to go through because it's owned here at the Petaluma Historical Library and Museum, the minutes of the Petaluma Women's Christian Temperance Union, their minute meetings. I thought, I wonder, did they say anything about winning the 1911 vote, since the Women's Christian Temperance Union was pro-suffrage? What did they say about it? It was fascinating. So in their minutes, which are one of the precious treasures here, these women took it seriously. They got to work. We want to encourage women to register. It was kind of interesting. They wanted to petition that a woman register women. They must have felt intimidated, and that it was an appropriate place for women to visit to register. Thought that was very interesting. So they were protecting women, obviously, from some forces that we're not certain what they were. And they also initiated a course in civics for themselves so that they could understand how to vote and what it meant to vote and fulfill their responsibility with honor. It's pretty impressive. And I wrote here that their work foreshadowed the work of Carrie Chapman Catt, who we saw in relationship to the 1896 campaign when she was a young woman and came here with Susan B. Anthony to campaign and lectured here in Petaluma. So this Petaluma Women's Christian Temperance Union saying, we need to encourage registration, we need to be good voters. They didn't talk about how they were going to vote. They weren't partisan, but they wanted to support voting and they wanted to be good voters. So they're foreshadowing Carrie Chapman Catt and her establishment of the League of Women Voters. Carrie Chapman Catt was very optimistic that the 19th Amendment was going to be ratified, because a few months before it was ratified, she established the League of Women Voters. And their goal is to encourage voting in a nonpartisan way and to educate people to be good voters. So we see that going on right here in the community of Petaluma, which I found really, really wonderful. The final thing about how Petaluma reacted to women getting the vote was, you know, sometimes things happen, but follow-through doesn't always happen quickly. This is a fabulous picture of the first jury in Sonoma County that had women on it. And guess what that date is? 1922. It took 10 years before a woman was accepted as a juror. And the excuses given were women were too emotional and they couldn't deal with the ugliness that might be presented in a court case, which is interesting. And also the fact that, well, who's going to take care of the children if a woman is serving jury duty? But in 1922, the first women were allowed on a jury in Sonoma County, and that jury included one woman from Petaluma, and we do know her name. She was Sophie Hamill. We're not certain which of the women she is. We don't have another portrait of Sophie Hamill, but she's one of the 5 women, and she did serve as a juror in 1922. It took 10 years, but women became eligible to serve as jurors. So Petaluma women and all California women won the right to vote in 1911, but the women in the United States had not won that right yet. That wasn't going to happen until the ratification of the 19th Amendment, August 18th, 1920. Okay, and people are a little confused about that date. August 18th is the date that the last state ratified the amendment and it became law, and August 26th is the date that it was signed into law, very quietly, but it was signed into law August 26th, and that is the Women's Equality Day, and that's when we're going to have our dedication of the exhibit, which I hope you all will tune in for the live stream. Anyway, so I had to have a wall here about it, even though it's not Petaluma-centric, about the final battle for the federal amendment. And I'm not going to go into this in detail. It is a wonderful story. One of the most interesting things about studying the women's suffrage movement is the history of the history. Originally, it was all written by men, and it was almost a footnote in history. Then, women's studies was established, and women said, excuse me, I think this was a very important movement, and now all historians admit it's the mother of the civil rights movement, and it's one of the great movements in the history of America. And now it's gotten what it deserves. In fact, in the last year, it's been hard to keep up with the scholarship. It's been so prolific. But anyway, a new part of the history was written from a new angle just recently in a PBS special called The Vote. And if you can get that on Netflix or however you get your live streamed information, and this was PBS, if you get a chance to watch this, it's very, very, very informative. It's mostly about this part of the battle, 1911 to 1920, and what it's saying is, you know, we've been writing the history saying, weren't these men nice to give us the right to vote? Because only they could vote. Oh, and when I first read that, it made sense. But if you watch this special, you will realize that's not how it works. Women had to fight. They had to get intense. And it's a fascinating story. And every American, particularly at this moment in our history, should know it. And if you get a chance to watch that, I recommend it highly. Very well done documentary. It tells the story from a very honest angle. What's going on here is this wonderful image called The Awakening. Very famous. It was published in Puck magazine. And it's Lady Liberty. I mean, you can almost see, you know, it's almost like the Statue of Liberty came down off of her pedestal and they've used her as an image. There she is with the torch in her hand. And she's walking across the United States, and in white are all the states that have given women the right to vote. And on the left. And then on the right, in black, with all these women reaching out for help from Lady Liberty, saying, bring us the vote, bring us the vote. And we see her bringing the torch of truth. It's a wonderful image. It's got a wonderful poem underneath if you ever get a chance to read that. It's very inspirational. And so, were there any women? I couldn't find any Petalumans, but I did find some Californians who, although they'd won the right to vote, in an altruistic manner worked for the 19th Amendment. One of them was Sarah Bardfield. And what this gal did, she started working for suffrage early in her life in Oregon and Nevada. And then, after we got the vote in California in 1911, she was a Californian, in 1915, there was the PPI, the Pan-Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. And there they had a booth. Okay, the Women's Suffrage Organization had a booth, and they were collecting signatures on a petition, and they gathered 500,000 signatures. Makes our little Petaluma and California petitions look a little small, but 500,000 at the PPI. Alice Paul assigned Sarah Bardfield to carry the petition in a car, and at this time, in 1915, believe you me, transcontinental travel in a car was not easy. She traveled in a car with this 500,000 petition and went to Washington, D.C. So she was a Californian doing a very altruistic deed, taking the petition to Washington, D.C. in 1915 after the PPI, and she personally presented it to President Woodrow Wilson. A second Californian who continued to work for suffrage was my favorite, Lydia Flood Jackson. She's associated with Oakland, California. And there's a beautiful quote here from her, and I'd like to read it. She was an early member of the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and the logo, the motto of those women was, and I can't say it without emotion rising up inside of my heart, it's lifting as we climb. That is so beautiful. It is such a phenomenal motto, lifting as we climb, that these women were dedicated to improving themselves and pulling others along with them. Anyway, she's part of this wonderful organization. That's their motto. And she's won the right to vote. And she's gathering with her fellow club members. And this is what she had to say. Who can break through a phalanx of determined, noble-minded, upright women backed by the power of the Holy Spirit? Suffrage stands out as one of the component factors of democracy. Suffrage is one of the most powerful levers by which we hope to elevate our women to the highest places of life. Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton saw by an eye of faith this gleaming field 60 years ago, and their determination, true judgment, and executive ability has made it possible for you and me to sit in the shade of the suffrage oak, a grand old tree whose branches will soon top every state of the Union. That's pretty inspirational. What a gal. The final victory. And here I want to say something, and this is a semantics issue. A lot of people say that the 19th Amendment did not give every woman the right to vote. Yes, it did. It didn't guarantee them the right to vote. And we read the 19th Amendment before, that what it did was it prohibited any state to deny the right to vote on account of sex, which meant they couldn't say you can't vote because you're a woman, which is what they said for decades. Okay, so you can't say that. That didn't mean they couldn't deny people the right, and women and men, the right to vote for other reasons. Okay? So that needs to be gotten really, really clear. So, the final victory. The right to vote cannot be denied on account of sex. And we have some really beautiful images from the suffragists. Lady Liberty in her Grecian garb, monumental, much bigger than the human woman, embracing her with the amendment in her hand, with the scales of justice in her hand. Beautiful image. This wonderful image, which is quite famous, it's iconic, which was issued by the League of Women Voters, and it's really looking into the future. It is this muse, this beautiful monumental Grecian goddess or muse, whispering in the ear of a human woman and pointing to a misty Capitol building why the woman puts her vote in the ballot box. What is she saying? It's obvious. Not only should you vote, you should run for office. So that's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poster, which was created soon after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This is the last display wall at the exhibit. And I was so excited, and it's entitled Victories and Defeats in the Fight for Universal Suffrage. And I was so excited to find that the Carnegie Institute for Democracy had created a scroll about a short history of voting rights. And it's succinct, it's clear, it's extremely well written, and it's really appropriate for this exhibit because we're in a Carnegie Library. I just love that. Former Carnegie Library, which is now the Petaluma Historical Library Museum, but originally this was Petaluma's Carnegie Library. Anyway, so this scroll, I was able to print it off, put it on foam core, and you can read it in the 4 columns of, as the title says, the victories and the defeats of voting rights. So many states have, through Jim Crow laws and other kind of laws, kept certain people, particularly black people, from voting. It is pretty doggone shocking. And it made me think, and it made me go back to that original panel, and Frederick Douglass, and Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott, and Sojourner Truth, and their early petition after the Civil War asking for universal suffrage. Wow, what problems we would have solved if we just listened to them. We still haven't listened to them. And this wonderful scroll explains it. And to bring it up to our current moment, maybe you don't know, but the Roberts Court watered down the Voting Rights Act and said it wasn't needed. But a lot of people disagree with that. And the late John Lewis attempted to initiate legislation to put that back in force. And that is now within the Congress. So this is an important issue, voting, who has the right to vote, who doesn't have the right to vote. And please let me tell you, anybody who tells you your vote doesn't count wants to disempower you. Your vote does count. I've seen so many examples of it. If you want to know how much your vote counts, read the story of the Tennessee legislature being the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And if you want to have really fun, Google Lady Gaga 19th Amendment. She did a fabulous movie, music video on it. It is so inspiring. And if you know the story of the Tennessee gentleman who cast the last vote, which got women the right to vote, you will know every vote counts. I want to thank the League of Women Voters and Debbie McKay, who is the president of the Sonoma County branch. She sent me all this literature. She sent me bookmarks. She sent me paper ballots. She sent me information on how to vote. She sent me brochures on voting. She sent me these 2 wonderful vote rocks, which the women of Sonoma County had painted and put throughout the county. So a big shout out and thanks to Debbie McKay. So also here at the museum, I made sure that there were 2 vote buttons, one in Spanish, one in English, and I hope that at some point all of you can come and see this exhibit and pick up your vote button for having come here and attended the exhibit as a gift from the Petaluma Museum Association. One of my reasons for wanting to do this exhibit was to encourage people to vote. The exhibit will run through the election. It will come down November 8th. So my best wishes to every one of you who've had the patience to watch through the exhibit and learn about Petaluma's participation in the women's movement. Thank you so much, and much love to everybody who's watched this exhibit. And Grandma here is going to say, make sure you vote. Bye-bye.
We love our girls as well. The law of love is from above, against that we ne'er rebel. If the men should see the women going to the polls to put down the liquor traffic, need it vex their souls. If we're angels as they tell us, can we once suppose that all the men should frown on us when going to the polls? We love our boys, our household joys, we love our girls as well. The law of love is from above, against that we ne'er rebel. No discharge have Christian women from the war with sin. At the polls with Gog and Magog must the fight begin. Since we've Bible marching orders, need it fright our souls, though all the men should frown on us when going to the polls. We love our boys, our household joys, we love our girls as well. The law of love is from above, against that we ne'er rebel.